October 12, 1943. Hearne, Texas. Hundreds of German soldiers stepped off the train, ready for chains, cages, and angry crowds. That's what they'd been told America would give them. But instead, the smell of bacon drifted from a diner. A jukebox played Glenn Miller. Children waved as if greeting guests, not enemies. And their guards? They walked behind casually, rifles down, as if no prisoner would even dare run. For men who thought capture meant misery, this was more shocking than battle. Why would America treat its enemies like this? And how did it change these men forever? Stay with us to find out. And if you love forgotten stories of World War II, make sure to subscribe, drop a like, and support the channel so we can bring you more untold history. October 1943. The Atlantic rolled in endless grey, convoys ploughing west under a shroud of anxiety. Packed into the holds of Liberty ships and converted troop transports, thousands of German prisoners taken in North Africa and Sicily braced for what lay beyond the ocean. Nearly 150,000 Axis soldiers had surrendered during the Tunisian collapse earlier that year, and the Allies could not house them all in Europe. America, with its vast interior, would become their destination. The men expected the worst. For months, Nazi propaganda had told them that capture by the Americans meant starvation, chains, humiliation. One Wehrmacht corporal later recalled, "We whispered that they would beat us, shave our heads, and lock us underground. Better the ocean than captivity." His words echoed the mindset of men trained to believe they were marching into a nightmare. The crossing itself was perilous. U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, and survivors could remember the smell of oil and salt, the sharp bark of alarms when sonar pings hinted at danger. Every creak of the hull sounded like death, one recalled. But no torpedo found them. The grey convoy thundered on, guarded by destroyers, bound for ports like Newport News, Norfolk, and Boston. When the ships docked, expectation collided with paradox. Instead of clubs or shackles, there were orderly lines, military police directing them with clipped commands but not cruelty. They were herded into waiting trains, the smell of coal smoke and hot metal replacing salt air. For many, it was their first unbroken sight of America. Green fields flashing by, farmhouses intact, no rubble, no ruins. The sight was unsettling. One private scrawled in a hidden notebook, "We saw cows grazing, fences standing, women hanging laundry. How could this country be at war? Our villages are ash." The disbelief was palpable. Even before they reached the Cami, P.S. the land itself was a rebuke to the Reich's narrative. In Texas, the prairie wind carried dust and the drone of cicadas as trains disgorged their human cargo at camp gates. Barbed wire gleamed, guard towers loomed, but the prisoners noted details that unsettled them further. Barracks with windows, canteens serving food, even soccer fields being marked off. This was no dungeon. The paradox deepened when guards spoke in a matter-of-fact tone, not in hatred. "Line up, collect your blankets, you'll be given uniforms." It was process, not punishment. One sergeant muttered in disbelief, "This isn't a prison, it's a village." The men were stunned to discover they would be clothed, fed and housed under rules written not by whim, but by treaty. The Geneva Convention of 1929, barely known to most draftees, would define their captivity. The Americans had both the resources and the will to adhere to it. Numbers mattered here. By late 1943, nearly 300,000 POWs had arrived in the United States, and that figure would climb to over 370,000 by war's end. Camps stretched from California deserts to New England forests, but the heartland, Texas, Nebraska, Iowa, Oklahoma, carried the largest burden. The disbelief of those first days never left many of them. "We expected to be treated like beasts," one wrote later. "Instead, we were treated like men." But arrival was only the beginning. What followed in the days ahead, the fingerprinting, the issue of uniforms, the steady cadence of camp life, would reveal just how differently this war would be remembered on American soil. The first stop for most captured Germans on American soil was not a camp in the open countryside, but a processing center. Forts in Virginia, New Jersey, and Louisiana became funnels where disoriented men were transformed from enemy soldiers into registered prisoners of war. The clang of typewriters echoed through long wooden halls, punctuated by the click of fingerprint ink rollers. Each man was logged, numbered, photographed, and issued a coarse denim uniform stenciled with large black letters. PW. The paradox deepened. Instead of being stripped and shackled, they were given shoes, socks, and even razors. "We could shave every morning," one prisoner remembered with disbelief. "In the desert we had lived like animals. In captivity we looked like soldiers again." The irony stung. Captivity granted them a dignity the collapsing Wehrmacht could no longer provide. The Americans were not improvising. Their procedures followed the 1929 Geneva Convention, a treaty signed by most major powers, including Germany and the United States. It guaranteed that POWs would receive food equal to that of American troops, access to medical care, shelter from violence, and even the right to send and receive mail. In practice, not every rule was perfectly observed, but the framework itself astonished prisoners who had been told they would be beaten and starved. Oversight came from the Provost Marshal General's office, a branch of the U.S. Army tasked with managing hundreds of thousands of captives. Camps were laid out like small military towns, barracks in neat rows, mess halls, canteens, and recreation fields. German officers were often kept apart from enlisted men, a separation intended to reduce indoctrination and maintain order. Some captives were singled out for another purpose. At Fort Hunt, Virginia, known only by the cryptic address P.O. Box 1142, selected prisoners with technical knowledge, U-boat officers, scientists, or high-ranking staff were interrogated in secrecy. They faced long questioning sessions, but even here, survivors noted, brutality was absent. They questioned us with patience, with tea and cigarettes, recalled a naval engineer decades later. It was more unnerving than shouting. The majority, however, never saw Fort Hunt. They were sent inland to sprawling camps ringed by barbed wire and watchtowers, designed to hold thousands. Trains rumbled through the night, prisoners staring out of narrow windows at a land that seemed untouched by war. Cornfields stretched to the horizon. Towns still lit their main streets at night, while in Germany blackout curtains smothered every lamp. The numbers alone were staggering. By early 1944, the United States was hosting nearly 350 camps spread across 46 states. Some held only a few hundred men. Others, like Camp Hearn in Texas or Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, housed more than 4,000 prisoners each. The logistical burden was immense, but the system functioned with bureaucratic precision. Within days of arrival, prisoners discovered routines that mirrored military life: roll calls at dawn, meals in the mess, assigned duties for camp maintenance. Complaints were heard, sometimes even addressed. "We wrote a petition about the bread being too soft," one POW laughed later. A week later, it was crustier. Imagine our shock that they listened. The contrast with Germany's treatment of captured Americans or Soviets was not lost on the men. Letters from Stalingrad survivors spoke of starvation, disease, and casual execution. Now, sitting in wooden barracks with pot-bellied stoves, some felt a shame that gnawed as much as homesickness. Still, suspicion lingered. Some prisoners whispered that this was a ruse, that leniency would turn to cruelty. But weeks stretched into months, and the routine held. Uniforms, rations, even Sunday church services were permitted. Slowly, disbelief hardened into reluctant trust. What came next would take that trust further. For in the American heartland, the paradox sharpened. The enemy would soon be led out of his camp, past barbed wire and guard towers, and into the streets of ordinary town, without chains. By the winter of 1943, a rumor swept through the barbed wire compounds. Some prisoners would be allowed outside. Few believed it. In Germany, captives were caged like animals. To walk among civilians? Impossible. Yet, one frosty morning in Texas, the gate clanged open, and squads of Germans filed out under the watch of a few armed guards. No shackles rattled. Boots crunched gravel freely. The paradox was immediate. They were enemies in uniform, albeit with the large PW stenciled across their chests. And yet they walked through American towns as if they were laborers on holiday. Guards kept a respectful distance, rifles slung casually. To the astonishment of the prisoners, people barely stared. Farmers tipped their hats. Shopkeepers paused at doorways. A diary from a Bavarian conscript captured the disbelief. "We were marched to town. I thought they would bind our hands. Instead, we strolled. We saw children lick candy canes. A girl waved. It was like waking from a nightmare into another life. The sensory shock overwhelmed them. The smell of bacon drifted from a diner. A radio spilled Glenn Miller's In the Mood from a drugstore window. Newspapers slapped against sidewalks as paperboys shouted headlines. In Germany, streets smelled of dust and smoke. Here, it was coffee and gasoline. At first, prisoners expected tricks. Would they be paraded for ridicule? But there was no jeering crowd, no humiliation. One recalled with awe, "The guards walked behind, not before us. They did not chain us because they trusted us not to run. And strangely, we did not." Trust was the hidden weapon. Escape was possible. The fields stretched for miles, and some tried, but most stayed. Where would they go? America was too vast, its people too observant. And the guards, though relaxed, carried authority. The freedom was symbolic, not absolute. Yet for men conditioned to fear brutality, it was staggering. Statistics reveal how common these outings became. By 1944, tens of thousands of POWs were regularly escorted into towns across Texas, Iowa, Nebraska, and Minnesota to perform labor or even shop at approved stores. Camp administrators reported escape rates of less than 1%, far lower than anyone expected. The absence of chains worked as well as any iron shackle. Some locals remembered these strange processions for decades. In Nebraska, a farmer's son later said, "It was odd. The enemy walking by our barn like neighbors. We kids followed them, curious. They didn't look dangerous. They looked tired." The paradox grew sharper when the prisoners compared the scene with what they had been told. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as brutal, decadent, racially divided monsters. Now they walked past schools intact, saw families shopping, and breathed an air free of fear. One officer muttered bitterly, "If Berlin knew of this, the war would collapse." Not all was cordial. Some townsfolk spat or turned away. Veterans groups protested the policy, demanding stricter treatment. Yet overall, the system worked. And it worked because the spectacle of freedom under watchful eyes cut deeper than punishment ever could. The escort walks became both routine and revelation. Every step down Main Street, every whiff of cigarette smoke or glance at a shop window, chipped away at a worldview forged under dictatorship. The men were still prisoners, but the absence of chains told them more about America than any leaflet dropped from a plane. What they saw next, fields, factories, and the sweat of honest labor, would bind theirs even more tightly to the paradox of captivity without cruelty. If the escorted walks into town unsettled German prisoners, the days that followed often reshaped them completely. America did not keep them idle behind wire. Instead, the country put them to work. By 1944, the War Manpower Commission coordinated with the Army to funnel POW labor into the very heart of the US economy. Fields needed harvesting, timber needed cutting, factories needed hands. And with millions of American men overseas, there were gaps only prisoners could fill. The paradox was glaring. Men who had once fought to destroy the United States now bent their backs to feed it. In Texas, cotton rows stretched to the horizon, the smell of damp earth clinging to clothes. In Nebraska and Iowa, prisoners swung hoes in sugar beet fields, sweat mixing with soil. Wisconsin sent them into dense forests, where the rasp of saws and the scent of fresh pine filled their lungs. It was grueling work, but not slavery. Prisoners were paid, not in cash they could carry away, but in scrip credits redeemable at camp canteens. Chocolate bars, shaving soap, cigarettes, and even writing paper became small luxuries. One recalled, "I earned more cutting sugar beets in Iowa than I had as a soldier in North Africa." It was absurd, but true. Numbers told the scale. By late 1945, more than 425,000 POW laborers in America performed over 45 million man-days of agricultural work. In some counties, German prisoners harvested as much as a third of local crops. Economists later noted that without POW labor, entire harvests would have rotted in the fields. For many farmers, initial suspicion gave way to gratitude. "They saved our farm," one Iowa woman wrote. "We could not have brought in the corn without them." Farmers often shared sandwiches, lemonade, or even homemade pie. The Germans tasted white bread rich with butter, sweet jams, and meat sandwiches unlike anything left in their home land. The irony was sharp. Their captors fed them better than their own army had. The sensory contrasts seared themselves into memory. A Hessian private remembered tasting an orange for the first time. In Germany, fruit was gone by 42. Here, it was like biting the sun. Others remembered the smell of fresh coffee brewed in thermoses carried to the fields, stronger and richer than ersatz brews back home. Still, mistrust lingered. Some American families glared as the enemy trudged past, resentful that men who had tried to kill their sons now worked their soil. Veterans organizations sometimes protested, accusing Washington of coddling the enemy. Yet the majority accepted the arrangement. The labor was too vital to ignore, and the rules too strict for real danger. Guards remained present, rifles at the ready, even if rarely used. The POWs themselves noted another paradox: freedom of movement within captivity. Working in open fields, they could see the sky unobstructed, smell the seasons, hear the buzzing of locusts or the rustle of cornstalks. Some could have run, but few did. Where could they go? Escape meant starvation or recapture. Work meant food, pay, and time outside the wire. In memoirs decades later, many admitted that labor changed them more than lectures ever could. One wrote, "We learned that America's strength was not in its weapons, but in its fields. Even its soil was richer than ours. They fed us from abundance we could not imagine. and when the day's labour ended, they returned under escort, not to chains or starvation, but to barracks with hot meals, letters from home, and sometimes even the music of Glenn Miller crackling over radios. But the work was only part of the revelation. Beyond the furrows and forests lay an even greater shock. The culture of a nation that opened its libraries, churches and music halls to men who had once sworn to destroy it. The labour kept German prisoners busy, but what lingered in their minds were the glimpses of American life they absorbed on those escorted outings. Every trip into town was like stepping through a looking glass. The Reich had painted America as degenerate, violent, collapsing under chaos. Yet Main Street told another story, one of neon signs, bustling cafes, and children pedaling bicycles under wide, safe skies. The paradox was striking. They were prisoners, their uniforms marked with bold PW letters, yet they tasted a freedom their families in Germany had not known in years. One private remembered, "We were enemies, yet people looked at us with curiosity, not hate." It was the greatest shock of all. The sensory palate dazzled them. Radios in store windows played Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, and Bing Crosby. The smell of buttered popcorn drifted from movie theatres, where posters for Casablanca and Yankee Doodle Dandy tempted passers-by. Grocery displays gleamed with canned fruit, chocolate and coffee tins stacked to the ceiling. Luxuries absent in Europe since 1940. The abundance seemed unreal. Inside the camps, Americans encouraged cultural engagement. Many compounds had libraries stocked with English and German books, classrooms for language study, and even orchestras organized by musically trained prisoners. In Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, German musicians performed Mozart and Beethoven on instruments loaned by locals. At Camp Hearn, Texas, prisoners staged plays, complete with costumes and painted backdrops, for fellow inmates and even guards. Sports thrived as well. Soccer matches drew hundreds of spectators within the wire, while baseball became a curious new passion. At first, we laughed at the strange game, one POW confessed. By summer, we were swinging bats. The crack of wood on leather, the smell of dust rising from bases became part of camp memory. Religion, too, played its role. Chaplains, both German and American, conducted Sunday services in makeshift chapel. Hymns echoed across compounds, voices rising in both German and English. For men far from home, it was a tether to dignity. Letters preserved their astonishment. One soldier wrote to his parents in Bavaria, "We are given the chance to read, to learn, even to play music. We thought captivity would be chains. Instead, it is as if we live in a school." Numbers highlight the scale of this cultural encounter. By 1945, the US Army had distributed more than 1 million books to POW camps and organized over 2,000 educational courses. Tens of thousands of men left America with better English than they had upon arrival. Still, suspicion existed. Not every American welcomed the idea of giving enemy soldiers libraries or musical instruments. Editorials questioned why German prisoners could watch movies while American boys bled in Europe. But the army defended its policy, pointing to the Geneva Convention and to the belief that humane treatment encouraged cooperation. The paradox was powerful. Every song heard on the radio, every paperback novel, every baseball game chipped away at the idea of America as a barbaric foe. It was not propaganda leaflets that shifted hearts, but the quiet, ordinary texture of life. And yet, for all the civility, tension simmered. Not everyone in town smiled at the sight of uniformed Germans. Mothers who had lost sons clenched fists. Black Americans, seeing the enemy treated with dignity, whispered bitterly about a freedom denied to them at home. The cultural exchange was real, but so were the divisions it exposed. What prisoners would encounter next in the stares and kindnesses and protests of American civilians revealed even more about the contradictions of a nation at war. If the German prisoners marveled at America's abundance, Americans themselves were often torn at the sight of them. The reactions were as varied as the people. On one hand, farmers, mill owners and factory managers came to depend on the labour. They saw young men from the Reich not as monsters, but as workers who kept crops from rotting and production lines humming. After a day in the fields, many farmers offered sandwiches, lemonade, or even slices of pie, gestures unthinkable under the propaganda that had defined the war. They worked hard, one Iowa farmer's wife recalled. In the end, we pitied them more than we hated them. But for others, the sight of enemy uniforms cut deep. Mothers whose sons lay in Normandy cemeteries clenched their jaws as they watched prisoners ride by in trucks. Veterans in small towns sometimes spat as the POWs passed. "Why should they eat steak while our boys eat K-rations?" One letter to the editor fumed. The paradox was especially sharp in the South. In Alabama and Texas, Black Americans noticed with bitter clarity that German prisoners, white men who had sworn loyalty to Hitler, were allowed to eat in restaurants that barred them. In some cases, prisoners sat down to meals in establishments where African Americans could only serve, not be served. One black veteran later wrote, "I fought for freedom, but when I came home, the German POWs had more of it than I did." This racial contradiction was not lost on the Germans. Some recorded in diaries their confusion that the same nation which gave them libraries, music and pie could deny its own citizens basic rights. For many, this hypocrisy became their most lasting impression of America. Still, kindness persisted. School children sometimes waved as prisoners marched past under guard. In rare moments, families left baskets of fruit at the roadside for them. At Christmas, church grew. PS sent gifts of candy, cigarettes or socks into camps. One prisoner recalled opening a package labeled simply "diner plates," the smell of gasoline on wide American streets, the taste of Coca-Cola, all lingered in recollections written years later. For men who had marched through deserts or frozen steppe, the sweetness of a soda in a camp canteen was unforgettable. Statistics confirm the scale of this recorded astonishment. By 1945, more than 350,000 letters a month were dispatched from POW camps across America to Germany, Switzerland or Red Cross relay stations. Even through censorship, the message of paradox reached families. Their sons were not starved or chained, but working, eating and even learning. Some letters turned bitter in tone. "I see a land of plenty," one soldier admitted, "and I wonder why we were told it was decadent." For men raised in the shadow of Nazi propaganda, the contradiction gnawed at their identity. Was the Reich's promise of superiority just a lie? For Americans who read intercepted mail or later heard memoirs, the impact was just as sharp. They realized their own ordinary acts, offering food, allowing prisoners to walk into town, had become weapons of truth, not propaganda, but lived reality. As the war's end drew near, these voices grew louder. Camps organized choirs, art exhibits and English classes, leaving cultural records that blurred the line between captor and captive. The voices captured in letters and memoirs ensured that what happened in those unchained walks and small-town encounters would not vanish with the closing of the camps. But the greatest test came with repatriation. Would these memories survive the voyage home, or dissolve in the ruins of a shattered Germany? The guns fell silent in May 1945, but for the prisoners in America, the war did not end at once. Trains still rumbled across the continent carrying men to harvests in Iowa, cotton fields in Texas, and logging camps in the Northwest. Repatriation was a vast logistical puzzle. Nearly 425,000 German POWs had to be returned in waves, first to Britain or France for labor duty, and only later to a broken Germany. For many, leaving was harder than arriving. In memoir after memoir, men confessed they dreaded departure. One prisoner at Camp Algona admitted, "I wished the train would never come. I had bread, music, even dignity here. At home there was rubble." Another recalled stepping off the ship in Bremerhaven in 1946 and feeling a shock at the hunger, the cold, the gaunt faces of civilians. The legacy of those unchained walks into American towns rippled outward. Some returned to Germany determined to rebuild a society on the model they had glimpsed. Open markets, democratic debate, even jazz and baseball. From a friend, suspicion remained, of course. Rumors spread that Nazis would sabotage factories or poison wells. Guards kept rifles slung, even if rarely raised. And in some places, protests erupted, small pickets demanding harsher treatment. Yet violence was rare. America had chosen to fight its enemy with abundance, not starvation. The statistics tell a quiet story. By 1945, fewer than 1% of POWs in US custody attempted escape, and almost all were recaptured quickly. Why run, when the land beyond the fences seemed less like enemy territory and more like a world of baffling generosity? The paradox deepened. America was ruthless in war, flattening cities in Germany and Japan, yet within its borders it extended to enemy soldiers a degree of humanity that astonished them. That contradiction, brutality abroad, civility at home, lodged itself in the memories of the captured, and it set the stage for what came next. When the war ended and the fences opened, many Germans carried back to Europe not just stories of hard labor, but memories of America's contradictions, kindness, and cultural wealth. The paradox of freedom within captivity was preserved not only in memory, but in ink. Every German prisoner was entitled under the Geneva Convention to write letters home, 2 per month, censored, but intact. Those letters, hundreds of thousands of them, carried astonishment across the Atlantic. "Dear Lotta," one prisoner scrawled in late 1944, "I am taken to town without chains. There are shops, cars, music. I do not understand it. His words were clipped by the censor's pencil, but the shock still leaked through. Camp newsletters, often edited by prisoners themselves, became another channel of testimony. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, Germans published Der Zaungast, the fence guest. Inside its mimeographed pages were poems, essays, even small illustrations. Some praised American kindness, others wrestled with the shame of defeat. To the guards and officers who allowed its printing, the newsletter was harmless. To historians, it became a window into the prisoners' conflicted souls. Oral histories decades later reveal even sharper astonishment. A former Afrika Korps officer, interviewed in 1983, recalled, "We marched through town, the rifles pointed down. I thought it a trick. In Germany, a prisoner is chained. In America, a prisoner walks free." Memoirs confirm the sensory strangeness of that freedom. The clatter of others carried darker memories of racial contradictions that revealed America's flaws. "They gave us freedom in chains," one wrote, yet denied it to their own citizens of color. The paradox endured. And yet, stories of kindness multiplied. Farmers who once employed POWs received letters from Germany years later. Thanks for a sandwich, a friendly word, a Christmas gift. Some former prisoners returned after the war, immigrating to the very land that had captured them. By the 1950s, veterans of both sides sometimes met again, not as enemies, but as neighbors. Statistically, the experiment had been astonishingly stable. Fewer than 3,000 escapes were attempted across the entire war, and almost all failed. Violence between prisoners and guards was rare. What endured instead was a memory of a nation powerful enough to fight ruthlessly abroad, yet confident enough to treat its enemies with a strange decency at home. The paradox came full circle. German soldiers had crossed the Atlantic expecting chains, cruelty, and starvation. They found instead pie on farmhouse tables, jukeboxes humming Glenn Miller, and towns that let them walk unbound under watchful but distant eyes. They had come as conquerors, they left as students. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, but its abundance.